Shabbat Shalom, everyone. What a joy it is to have such a wonderful simcha and all of the kids running around in shul, something we have missed for almost 2 years. And it's really great to have it again. Something about Tinokot, Yiladim, something about kids running around on cue. Which is, it's great. It's great. We love their energy. We miss their energy. And they even left me one orange sun-kissed fruit gel. It was a bitterly cold December night in 1995 when a massive fire broke out in Malden Mills in Lawrence. The fire destroyed 3 buildings and left the textile factory in inoperable ruin. It was one of the worst fires in all of Massachusetts history, and 20 of the employees were seriously burned. Since it was just about 2 weeks before the Christmas holiday, and there were now 1,400 displaced workers. This was not just an economic blow to them and to the entire city of Lawrence, but also a psychological blow. The owner's advisors said this would be a great opportunity to quit the upholstery business that accounted for most of their revenue. And most people assumed in the city of Lawrence that they would lose their biggest economic driver as Malden Mills would close or would move somewhere to the south, being rebuilt elsewhere. While thankfully no one was killed, this was to be a major financial tragedy for everyone involved. But the factory was not owned by just anyone. It was owned by Aaron Feuerstein, an observant Jew who embodied both the values of Judaism and Menschlichkeit, the values of being a good and decent person. As his family's 3-generation business continued to burn the next day, Feuerstein stood up right in front of the still smoldering ruins and promised that he would rebuild right there. The Boston Globe wrote, quote, "In an era that celebrated executives whose successes were based on slashing workforces or sending jobs overseas, the very stubborn Mr. Feuerstein was twice recognized by President Bill Clinton for standing by his workers. He earned a reputation for altruism after the fire when he generously continued to pay all of his workers $1,400, all of their wages and all of their health benefits, while rebuilding the business his grandfather had started back in 1906. Mr. Feuerstein died a couple of weeks ago, and while I was reading his obituary in the Boston Globe, I was reminded of the great value of doing the right thing, even when it doesn't help you, even when it might be difficult for you. The rabbis teach us that we should not simply act by doing what the law as a minimum requires, but we should act lifnim mishurat hadin, above and beyond what the law asks of us. Mr. Feuerstein modeled a life of integrity. This morning's Torah reading continues the trilogy of texts about Jacob. While he begins his life deceiving his brother out of his birthright and stealing his brother's blessing by tricking his father, Jacob changes. Last week we read about how Jacob was deceived by his father-in-law, for whom he ends up working for 20 years, first to marry Laban's 2 daughters, and then to establish himself and his family by acquiring many flocks and building up his estate. And then finally this morning, the narrative comes full circle as he seeks to reunite with his brother Esau. As Sarah discussed in her insightful Dvar Torah, this reconciliation which he initiates is a most challenging act. And as Rabbi Kling-Perkins introduced the Haftarah, reconciliation is an ongoing and not easy process. But of course, it's most praiseworthy. Rabbi Harold Kushner, in his pithy but very sagacious book, Living a Life That Matters, connects Aaron Feuerstein's story to Jacob. And he points us to one word. The word is tam. When Jacob is born, as he's growing up, the Torah says that he is ish tam, yoshev oalim, that he was a tam man, a mild man who preferred to stay in the camp. And this is juxtaposed with his brother, right? His twin brother, Esau, who was a hunter, an outdoorsman. But of course, the word tam, like many words in Hebrew, has many connotations. If we go back to the story of Noah, Noah is described as an ish tzaddik, tamim haya b'dorotav. Noah was a righteous man, tamim like tam, in his generation, usually translated as blameless, perfect in his generation. But of course, this word tamim, doesn't quite sound as positive because it's relative to the people in his generation, and his generation wasn't so good. The word tam also appears in the book of Job, right in the beginning, where Job is described as ish tam v'yashar, vayera Elohim b'sar mira. He is a blameless and upright person, one who fears God and shuns evil. So I'll ask you the question, is Jacob really like Job? Is he blameless? No, he's not. Like the rest of us, he's complicated. He starts out devious and deceitful, and as he grows and changes, he becomes a more and more compelling character. Last week, we read about his flight from his brother. He lays down to sleep. He's reached rock bottom, to use a pun on his pillow, finding himself isolated from others due to his overzealous narcissism. He's someone who at that point doesn't care about others. In his famous dream of the angels ascending and descending, God reassures him. God tells him that despite his previous mistakes, God will be with him. And God recognizes his essential goodness, something that all of us possess. Sometimes we have to dig a little bit for it, but it's always there. Jacob comes to realize what Aaron Feuerstein knew instinctively. It's not about getting ahead and simply making money at the expense of other people. Life is about relationships and how we treat others. This morning's Torah portion records then the next stage in Jacob's development. Before Jacob reconciles with his twin brother, a mysterious assailant attacks Jacob, and he wrestles with him all night. This encounter leaves Jacob limping away from the encounter, but he also has a new name, Yisrael, Israel. Now, my favorite understanding about this mysterious assailant is that he's not something external, but it's his own conscience. He has become more aware of himself and his actions. The Torah teaches that his new name relates to wrestling with God and people, perhaps indicating that Jacob is now more open to God's ethical teachings and to the pain and vulnerability that comes with all human relationships. Now, as we, my friends, look around the world today, we see a very broken world, one with great challenges. There's a loss of decency in kindness, in how we speak and relate to one another. There's a loss of concern for those who need it the most. Jacob becomes a model for us because he's not perfect. He's far from this Tom description. He's far from blameless. But he may be precisely what enables us to relate to him more easily as we see him, his transformation that occurs on the journey throughout his life. After Jacob reconciles with his brother, Esau and Jacob go on their own separate ways to settle down and to continue their lives. And the Torah uses a very interesting phrase, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem, that Jacob arrives Shalem, like the word shalom. He is somehow more whole as he arrives at the city of Shechem. What does this word shalem mean exactly? Some people say safe. He arrived safely at this town, safe and sound. But as our Eitz Chaim commentary explains, shalem could also mean he arrives in friendship, in a state of kindness. Rabbi Kushner points out in the commentary that Jacob has become shalem, whole, united with himself, his internal conflicts subsiding. He has become now a person of integrity. Now, while most of us are not going to reach the heights of Aaron Feuerstein, I certainly won't, but we can strive. We can strive for that. Let that model of Jacob living a meaningful life, a life of purpose, a life of relationships, a life of integrity. Let that life that he leads be a model for all of us and something we can strive for. Shabbat Shalom.